Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary, University of London. My name is Simon and it's my privilege as Director of the Institute to welcome you all to our inaugural annual symposium in the Humanities and Social Sciences. The IHSS was established in 2018 to bring together scholars from across the faculty's 8 schools to share ideas, develop new research, and explore innovative approaches to scholarly and public problems alike. This past academic year has been our first full year of operation, but today's event was something we wanted to do from the start. Queen Mary is a university which has long been at the forefront of pushing for social justice and greater equality. And this annual symposium celebrates those values by bringing to Queen Mary each year the author of a book or a body of work that not only makes a major intellectual contribution, but which carries the potential to transform social and political debate more broadly. For this inaugural event, we could scarcely have a more fitting speaker than Thomas Piketty, whose latest book, Capital and Ideology, was published in English last fall. Because of Capital and Ideology then, but also because of the much broader repertoire and reach of his work, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the IHSS today, even if only virtually, Thomas Piketty, Professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and the Paris School of Economics and co-director of the World Inequality Lab. Thomas' work addresses the interplay between economic development, the distribution of income and wealth, and political conflict. He is, of course, best known as the author of possibly the single most influential book published this century, and certainly the best-selling economics book, Capital in the 21st Century, to which Capital and Ideology provides in many ways the requisite sequel. But as many of you will know, Thomas has long been an active and engaged intellectual in numerous other ways too, including as a leading force behind the Manifesto for the Democratization of Europe movement, TDEM, proposing nothing less than a new European Assembly, a theme that he also takes up in Capital and Ideology. I'll say a little more about Thomas' book itself in a few moments. Let me first welcome equally enthusiastic speakers for today, who have each agreed to offer a response to Thomas' book and to join Thomas and I in a discussion about some of the themes that it raises. Heather Boushey is President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and a leading voice on economic inequality in the United States. She's also the author of Unbound, How Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. Heather joins us from Washington, DC. Martin Sandbu is European economics editor for the Financial Times, was previously its economics leader writer, and is author of the forthcoming book, The Economics of Belonging. Martin is in fact the only one of today's speakers in London. I'm speaking from his native Norway, and Thomas is joining us from Paris. Clearly, what COVID has done to the era of hyper-globalization Thomas discusses towards the end of the book is a theme to which we will be turning. For those wondering how long it takes to get that far into, which runs shy of 1,100 pages, I have some bad news for you. It's a bit like Hilary Mantel's Cromwell novels. You think, perhaps even secretly hope, the second one is going to be a dud, that perhaps you can skip reading it altogether. Then it turns out to be better. Capital and Ideology is better, I think, because here politics enters into the picture of socioeconomic inequality in an original and illuminating way. In essence, the book seeks to uncover the institutional and political arrangements that sustain socioeconomic inequality and the struggle of ideas and values that underpins those arrangements in turn. At a political moment when we are encouraged to think about short-term solutions to seemingly short-term problems, we find in these pages the consolations of a more patient art. Capital and Ideology traverses centuries and the continents alike. It's like listening in on a fervent discussion between Alexis de Tocqueville and Fernand Braudel, with occasional sharp interjections from Karl Marx and Hannah Arendt. The effect is to put on the page before you the full human drama of what goes into making a regime of inequality, from the long legacy of slavery and indentured labor, via the sacralization of the importance of property to political order, to the wrong turns of the dogma of the state in communist regimes, the unfinished and more modest revolutions of social democracy, and the disenchantments of neoliberalism. It's all here, from digressions on Hayek to forensic explanations of the history of taxation. All take their place at the table of an incessant inquiry into the political origins of inequality, if I may. In effect, what you do here in this book, Thomas, is to retell a history of the modern age through the lens of what you call inequality regimes. That's one of a series of concepts the book provides us with. You also outline and describe socio-political tendencies such as social nativism, a bad thing, your account shows, and possibilities such as social federalism, which you see as a good thing. Often large tomes like this are simply bricks to beat people with, but this book is nuanced throughout. Hence, you seek to make the case at the end of the book for what you call participatory socialism, and yet you also push against a reduction of social conflict to class divides. I'll say no more about the book itself, since I know you'll all be keen to hear Thomas speak and our other guests to engage in a conversation about it. First, Thomas is going to speak for around half an hour before Heather and then Martin offer their response. And once Thomas has had a chance to reply, I'll then chair a discussion between the four of us, and you are welcome to begin posting questions then. And we'll make sure we find time towards the end for your questions. And with that, I'll hand the screen over to Thomas Piketty.
Thank you, Simon. So I assume everything is working fine and that you can all hear me. So I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk about this book, and thanks Simon for all the good things you said about the book. And let me start right away by saying that so in this talk I'm going to present some material from this book. So let me move to the next slide. And so this book, Capital and Ideology, you said it, Simon, but I really believe it. I think it's a better book than my previous one. I mean, it's still, of course, very imperfect. It's, I'm making a slow progress, and I try to listen to criticism, to comments, to learn from them. I'm maybe not as fast as I should, but, I try to do my best, and I will try in my next book, to keep making progress in the right direction. I think this book is better than the previous one. First, because it is less Western-centered. So it's again a book about the history of inequality, but my previous book, Capital in the 21st Century, was very much centered on Western Europe, North America, a little bit Japan. I mean, this one is probably still too much Western-centered, but at least it opens up the discussion. There are large chapters on the case of India, Brazil, colonial societies, Africa, China, Russia. And on the general interpretation of what I find, I guess that the main novelty is that by opening up the set of historical trajectories that I look at, I have come to the conclusion that in the end, political and ideological determinants of inequality are really critical. It is not to say that economic forces, technological forces are not important at all, but in the end, the general conclusion is that for a given level of economic development or technological development, one observes across histories a very large diversity of what I call inequality regime, which I characterize as a set of justification for a certain level and structure of inequality, and these dominant ideologies and the set of institutions that they support, coming with this dominant ideology, can change much faster than what typically the dominant groups in a given society tend to imagine. Dominant groups always tend to naturalize inequality, to present them as being permanent, natural, but in practice you observe very fast variation, sometimes following deep crises, including wars, financial crises, but sometimes also, through more peaceful social and political mobilization. And in all cases, the balance of power between the different groups is not only about material balance of power, but very much about different discourse, different ideology, which I believe need to be taken seriously if we want to to properly analyze this evolution. So in this presentation, I'm first going to describe, very quickly the contents of the book, the organization of the book, just to give you a sense of what I do. So, the book is organized more or less in a chronological order. First part one is about the transition from what I describe as ternary societies based upon three functional classes, nobility in charge of warrior class in charge of law and order, a clerical class in charge of intellectual guidance and to some extent educational services and health services, and a third estate. And I show how this organization of society through different trajectories is being transformed, in particular in France with the French Revolution, but more generally in most European societies. We observe in the 19th century the rise of what I call ownership societies, based on the form of sacralization of property, which I will come back to in a minute. Part two is about slave and colonial societies and the way European ownership societies domination in the rest of the world has completely transformed the conditions of the formation of the centralized state and the transition from ternary type logic to ownership type societies in the rest of the world. So in particular, there's a long chapter on India, which I will not present much in this short presentation, but which I'd be happy to comment upon later, which to me is quite important in the whole the full thinking of the book. Part three is about what I refer to as the Great Transformation, following Polanyi's 1944 book, which is basically the crisis of ownership societies, in particular between 1914 and 1945, the rise of social democratic societies, communist and post-communist societies, and the recent rise of hyper-capitalism following the fall of Soviet communism. And part four focuses more on the electoral cleavages and the transformation of the sort of left-right political structure of the post-war period to the rise of what I describe as the Brahmin left and a sort of new structure of political and electoral cleavages which we see today. So I'm going to go quite fast in this presentation in order to give you a sense of this different part of the book, but of course the book is very long. I apologize for this. At the same time, I think it's very readable. It contains a lot of empirical material, over like 169 figures and tables. And if you go to this website, you will find all of them online, and you will get a better sense of what I do in the book. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to cover these 4 points, but I'm going to do that pretty fast. First point is going to be about the sacralization of property in the 19th century and what I call the failure of the French Revolution and the colonial inequality peak. Second point is going to be about the role played by social mobilization leading to the reduction of inequality in the 20th century. Third point will be about post-communism, the failure of Reaganism, and the rise of inequality in recent decades. And the fourth point will be about what I describe as elements for an alternative path for the future, in particular with the idea of social federalism and what I call in the book participatory socialism. So let me start right away with the first point. What I describe here as the failure of the French Revolution is the idea that there's a theoretical claim that with the French Revolution we enter into an era of equality of rights, formal equality of rights, but in practice, because of the sacralization of property, partly because of the fear of not, knowing where to stop in terms of redistribution, we actually see rising inequality throughout the 19th century. Financial compensation to slave owners at the time of abolition of slavery, both in France and in British slave islands, can be viewed as a sort of extreme form of what I mean by the sacralization of property, and more generally the colonial inequality peak that we see up until World War I illustrates this very well. So let me show you a couple of graphs. This is the evolution. So here on this graph, you have the evolution of the concentration of ownership in a country like France, but I should say, it will be very similar in Britain. It will be very similar in most European countries. So what you see is that throughout the 19th century, you have a very, very high level of concentration of property, with the top 1% alone who owns almost 70% of total wealth in Paris at the eve of World War I. In Britain, it will be more than 70%. And you really need to wait for the 20th century, World War I, World War II, to have this decline in the concentration of property. You have an increase in the concentration of property again starting in the 1980s, 1990s. But I should stress, that in the long run, there are two things you can remember from this graph. First, in the long run, you do have a reduction of inequality, and this is the optimistic part of my book is really about this. I stress very much that in the long run, we've seen a process of, in a way, learning about more equitable economic system, or less unequal economic system, and this reduction of inequality in the long run has been very successful, in the sense that it has come with more with broader access to economic opportunities, broader access to education. It has come with more prosperity, and I think so in the long run, the reduction of inequality that happened during the 20th century is one of the factors that also allowed for faster economic growth and more prosperity in the 20th century than ever before. And I think we could and should continue this in this direction in the long run. So this is the first point. The second point that you see on this graph is that although you do have a reduction of inequality in the long run, we should not exaggerate the magnitude of this reduction of inequality, in the sense that the decline in the share of total wealth owned by the top 1% has been mostly to the benefit of the next 10 or 20 or 30% of the population. But if you look at the bottom 50% of the population, they still don't own anything, basically. They had 2% of total wealth in the 19th century. They now have 5 or 6% in France. In the US, it will be 1 or 2%, and it was 3 or 4% 30 years ago. But, in any case, in all countries, for the bottom half of the population, the wealth is something that is pretty abstract. And this is not because these people are young. That would be the same within each age group. And so one of the big questions that I raise in my book is this the best we can do? Or what should we do about this? Should we just wait for economic growth and market competition to spread the wealth towards the bottom 50%? The problem is that we've already been waiting for a long time. So I think we need to, that's one of the limits of the social democratic societies and set of institutions that have been developed in the 20th century, is that they had many achievements in terms of greater equality in access to education, health, and more labor rights, etc. But in terms of deconcentration of property, we need to think of something more that has not yet been done in the past, and this is why in the book I talk about systems of inheritance for all and systems of more equal sharing of power in corporation, with more workers' rights, even if you don't have wealth. So I think we need to do both. We need to redistribute wealth more, and also redistribute power toward workers as such, even if they don't have shares in companies. And so this figure sort of illustrates a little bit how I come to this. Now, why is it that in the 19th century you have no decline in inequality at all, in spite of the sort of egalitarian promise of the French Revolution. Well, I think there was a lot of hypocrisy and ambiguity in this promise, and there was some discussion at the time of the French. Yeah, I should say, maybe let me mention that what I've just shown you for France, this very high in patrimonial inequality at the eve of World War I is something that you find not only in France but also in Britain, also in Sweden. Sweden is an interesting case because we tend to see Sweden today as a very equal country, but in fact for a long time it was extremely unequal. Until 1911 in Sweden you had a system of political rights that were completely determined by wealth ownership, and you could have up to 100 voting rights in legislative election if you were sufficiently wealthy, whereas the people with limited wealth, well, only the top 20% people could vote in any case, only the top 20% male voters could have the right to vote, but within this top 20% group of male voters, you could have between 1 and 100 voting rights in Sweden until 1911. And in municipal election, there was actually no upper limit, and you had several dozen municipalities in Sweden where actually only one voter had more than 50% of the voting right, including the municipality of the prime minister of the time, who was an aristocrat like most prime minister in Sweden at the time. And if you had told someone in Sweden, in 1910, okay, you're going to become one of the most equal country in history, it would have been hard to believe. And it is really, that's a very interesting story of how mobilization, social mobilization by the trade union movement, the Social Democratic Party, who takes power in 1932 and uses the state capacity that was built before in order to distribute political rights in relation to your wealth. Now you use the state capacity in order to make people pay tax in relation to their wealth. So this is a sort of very clear illustration how the long-run process of state building and state centralization can give rise to very different ideologies and very different political projects, and in the end level of inequality. Now, if we coming back a little bit to the case of France, there was some discussion about progressive taxation already at the time of the French Revolution. So here, on this slide, I show you two examples of proposals that were discussed at the time of the French Revolution. You can see both for a progressive income tax and a progressive tax on inherited wealth, tax rate going from 5% for people below average to over 70% above average. So this is very similar to what was actually applied in the 20th century, in particular in countries like the US and Britain, and also Sweden and France in the end. But at the time of the French Revolution, this idea, the balance of power somehow did not allow for the actual implementation of this kind of ideas. And during the full 19th century, you have a flat tax system with, in particular, inheritance tax is 1%, whether you live, 1,000 francs or 100 million francs, and this is pretty much the same everywhere. One way to illustrate, this extreme sacralization of property, as I said before, is the inequality in within the slavery system, and then in post-slavery colonial societies. This is just to mention the extreme case of Saint-Domingue, which was the largest, not only the largest French slave island in the 18th century, but in fact the largest concentration of slaves within the entire Atlantic slave system. It was over 500,000 slaves at the eve of the French Revolution. There was a slave revolt, and Saint-Domingue became independent in 1804 under the name of Haiti. Now, in 1825, the French state finally recognized the independence of Haiti, but only with one condition, is that Haiti will have to repay to the French slave owners the price of the slaves, in effect, the price of the property that was lost by the French slave owners. And so the price was set at the time at the equivalent of about 300% of Haiti GDP at the time, so more than 3 years of output, which of course was impossible to reimburse in 1 year. So, the French bankers will come to help, so to speak, refinance the debt. And in the end, Haiti had to repay this debt to a consortium of French and then later US bankers from 1825 to around 1950. Okay, and so today Haiti is asking France to pay back some of this money, which people in power in France, the government don't want to hear about that. And in 2004, for the 200th anniversary of Haiti, the French president did not go to the celebration because he didn't want to hear about this request. I think this is an interesting part of the story, of the full story, because at the time, in the 19th century, both in France and Britain, all intellectuals, at least all liberal intellectuals, like people like Tocqueville, which we celebrate today, for them it was completely obvious that we should compensate slave owners. We should not try to compensate slaves, but we should compensate slave owners. And the argument was something like this: if you expropriate slave owners, then where are you going to stop? Because what are you going to do with someone who owns slaves in the past and who today has sold his slaves in Saint-Domingue and owns a building in Paris or a castle near Bordeaux or a financial portfolio, and so you will never be able to know where to stop. Therefore, don't even try. And I think this kind of argument saying, okay, don't. We need to sacralize property rights that were acquired in the past, no matter how unfair, no matter how unequal, because if we start opening this Pandora's box of redistribution, we will never know where to stop. I think this kind of argument has been very powerful in the 19th century, and we see today the kind of sacralization of the level of wealth of billionaires or oligarchs or wherever their wealth come from, which I think has some similarity with this ideology. And I think it's important again to put this into a broad perspective. Now, there will be a lot more to say about the entire rise and fall of Euro-American slavery. Let me simply mention that in every major abolition, there was discussion about compensating the slave owners, and there was never any compensation of slaves, in particular the US case, which is today being discussed a lot in the discussion about reparation, which I think is an issue that will play an important role again in the future and cannot be just ignored as easily as some people would like to ignore it. But more generally, if you look at inequality in historical perspective, you can see that colonial societies and in particular slave societies like Haiti, but more generally colonial societies like French Algeria or South Africa are among the most unequal societies you see in history, and that the proprietarian ideology and the colonial system really came hand in hand together, until pretty much the middle of the 20th century, which is of course very, not very long ago when you take this very long run perspective and inequality. So I look more in the book at different patterns of inequality, for instance, in French colonial Algeria with an extremely unequal and segregated educational system. People right now in France, like to say, oh, but France has nothing to do with segregation in the US. We don't know about segregation. Well, of course, there was huge segregation and unequal legal rights within the French empire, in particular between North Africa and metropolitan France. So this is something I study a lot more in the book, in particular about inequality of educational investment in the colonies as compared to inequality of educational investment today. I cannot enter into the details here, but this is quite important for the overall picture. I'm going accelerate here a little bit because I need to move on. I want to say a few words about the reduction of inequality in the 20th century and the role played by social mobilization, socialist movement. So, I try to show in the book that the periods of reduction of inequality very often come from a mixture of dramatic events and crises and longer run intellectual evolution. And if you have only one of the two, it's usually not enough. Big crises in themselves do not necessarily lead to reduction of inequality, and pure intellectual movement and political mobilization without new crises and new challenges often also are not enough to deliver real change. And it's really the mixture of the two which I see as one of the key to deliver a big change in inequality regime. So this is what you see after World War I and World War II. You see the rise of social spendings in particular, which was rising a little bit before World War I, but it was really very slow. In particular, educational spending, was still less than 1% of national income in all countries before World War I. It was a little higher in the US than in Europe, but it was very small. Today, it's 5-6% of national income in public educational investment. It has actually been stagnating in recent decades, which I think is one of the reasons for rising inequality and also declining growth rate. In the 20th century, you also see the invention of the kind of progressive taxation that was already discussed, as I said before, in the 18th century, but that was not actually implemented, at least in a durable manner, until the 20th century. So, I think it's time to revisit this history. I try to give a lot of evidence in the book showing that, in particular in the US, the era of very high tax progressivity, I think in the end this was a pretty successful experience. So this changed dramatically following the 1980s, as we know, but between 1930 and 1980, on average, the top income tax rate in the US was over 80%. You have the same evolution for progressive inheritance tax, as you can see on this graph. Another aspect that plays a very important role in 20th century redistribution is also the desacralization of public debt and private property in general. So you can see after, here you can see, before World War I, you had this huge level of foreign assets that private property owners own in the rest of the world, in particular through colonial assets. This was reduced very fast during World War I, World War II through expropriation, inflation, and also in order to pay for the war. And if you look, so this is, you have this peak in colonial assets and foreign assets in general before World War I. After World War II, this big pile of foreign assets has been to a large extent transformed into public debt. And then, most European countries, are going to make the choice not to repay this public debt, and they decide to get rid of this public debt through various mechanisms. In particular in Germany and Japan, you have very large progressive tax on private wealth portfolio, up to 50% wealth tax in Germany, up to 80% in Japan, and very large private wealth portfolio in order to redistribute a little bit the burden and of defeat in a way, and also to be able to have more financial capacity to invest in reconstruction and post-war growth. And retrospectively, this also happened in France and in many other European countries, and this was largely successful as an historical experience. So if you okay, I have lost track of the slides, but I guess yeah, I don't see the slides anymore, but I guess yes, okay, up. Yeah, so let me accelerate and come to, say a few words about the most recent period and the part of my book about the recent period. So, starting in the 1980s, you have the Reagan and Thatcher neoliberal ideology that, takes power in the US and the UK. In the US, you have a very large reduction of, you can see on this graph on the red curve, the top income tax rate is basically divided by 2. It was over 70% on average in 1950, 1990, and it has been about 35% on average between 1990 and 2020. This was supposed to boost growth and innovation, or at least this was the rationale that was put forward in the 1980s. The idea was, okay, we're gonna reduce progressive taxation, we're gonna give, in effect, more possibilities for entrepreneurs at the top to accumulate more wealth. But in the end, because this is going to boost innovation and growth, maybe inequality will increase, but growth will increase so much more than that, in the end, the income and wages of the entire population will rise like we've never seen in US history, or at least this was the discourse. Now, as you can see in practice, this is not exactly what happened, because if you look at national income per capita, the growth rate has actually been divided by 2. Between 1990 and 2020, it has been only 1.1% per year, whereas in 1950 to 1990, it was 2.2%, 1910 to 1950, it was about 2.1 and 1.8 between 1870 and 1910. So the past 30 years, 1990 to 2020, have been particularly bad. I think, the reason, in my view, is not so much the rise of inequality, although the rise of inequality certainly was not particularly good to have a balanced growth going on. But I think the most important missing factor for this graph is the stagnation of educational investment, which to me is the main factor both for the rise of inequality and the decline in growth rate. But at the very least, what you can see from this graph is that the rise of inequality in itself and the decline in progressive taxation is certainly not a convincing strategy to boost innovation and growth. And I think it's high time that we can have a more rational and evidence-based discussion about this, which is complicated because, as once we start having this discussion about high progressive tax rate, many people get very upset very fast, and it's very difficult to have a quiet conversation. But I'm trying to contribute to this in this work. I don't know how successful it will be. Of course, many other people are also trying to move us in this direction. I realize that I may already have talked for too long, so maybe let me conclude with the political cleavage part of the book and the last part of the book. I think what's very striking, one of the very striking findings that I present in this book is summarized on this graph, is about what I refer to as the rise of the Brahmin left. It's very striking to see the similar evolution in countries with very different political parties and very different political tradition, including US, France, Britain. And what we see in all these countries is that the Democratic Party in the US, or the Socialist Communist Party in France, or the Labour Party in Britain, despite all their differences in their intellectual roots and history, they have all gone through this same sort of Brahmin left evolution, in the sense that in the 1950s, 1960s, they used to attract the voters with the lower education, the lower income, the lowest property ownership levels, and over time they have actually become the party of the most highly educated. And I try to explain this in my book, and I certainly don't claim I have the perfect explanation. I think this is such a complicated evolution, and you have supply and demand factors that are moving together. It's very complicated to disentangle everything. But the one thing I would like people to remember is that you cannot have a single country explanation. So in particular, in the US debate, people stress a lot the role of the civil rights movement in the 1960s as starting the process of, you know, the white lower class and lower middle class moving from Democrat to Republican. But, you know, you don't have the civil rights movement in the 1960s in France or Britain or if you look at the next graph, you know, Germany or Norway or Sweden, and you have the same general evolution. So I think it's important to come with more general explanation. And to me, this reflects the fact that the social democratic parties, the social democratic post-war coalition, broadly speaking, was not really able or willing to fully update their redistributive platform. And at the end of the period, starting in the 1980s, 1990s, they appear as a coalition that is mostly working for the benefit of the most highly educated group and has sort of abandoned the lowest education and lowest income group in terms of redistributive platform, in particular in the way to regulate globalization. And to me, maybe one of the a graph of the book, you know, and I'm going to stop there, and the next graph is, you know, if you look at who voted to remain in the European Union in the Brexit referendum, you know, you can see that basically the top 10% group, either in terms of education, income, and wealth, you know, were very enthusiastic to remain in the European Union, but, you know, the bottom 50 or 60% group were very much against. Now, when you show this kind of graph in my country, you know, in France or in other European countries, you know, some people say, well, you know, this is because of this stupid British nationalism. There's nothing we can do. You know, well, except that, in fact, you have exactly the same graph if you look now, and I'm going to stop there, on the referendums that took place in France over Europe in 1992 and 2005. And so I think it reflects a deeper problem, which is the way we organize European integration and more generally the way we organize globalization is very much to the benefit of the most mobile, high income, high human capital, high financial capital groups, whereas people in the middle and the bottom, you know, feel that they are very much left apart, you know, left aside from this evolution. And if we don't reorganize globalization differently, so I discuss in my book, and Simon referred to our manifesto for the democratization of Europe, but, you know, more generally, the bottom line is, I don't think you can have free trade and free capital flows between any two countries if you don't have at the same time some common taxation, some common public regulation. And, you know, of course, it's a big change in the sort of the narrative and the storytelling that we've been telling to ourselves about globalization, which is really based on the idea that you can get free trade, free capital flows in exchange of nothing at all in terms of taxation and regulation. But I think, you know, this will have to change. Maybe the current crisis will contribute to make us move in this direction, but I think it will require much deeper intellectual, political changes, which, you know, I'm trying to analyze in my book, but which, you know, of course, will require a lot more attention. So let me stop there. I think I have already spoken for too long, so I'm not sure what to do and how I should stop, and someone is going to tell me something. Simon, are you here? Yes.
Hi, Thomas. Yes. I'm here, and hopefully on video too.
So sorry, I probably overshoot completely my time. Sorry.
No, we're good. We're good. It's fascinating to hear. It's not a short book to summarize, so I think we grant you a little bit of latitude there. I found your last point really interesting. You know, countries do not exist in isolation, and so therefore they really shouldn't be governed as if they did. And I think that really cuts to the core of some of the arguments that you make, whether the historical ones about what's happened through the history of progressive tax rates and how that influences through inequality, what's happening within the economy, or else the more broader points that you're making about inter-country comparisons and the need for learning across and thinking about how transnational solutions may need to be a part of this. I'd like to now bring in Heather Boushey, who's going to offer a few comments and responses to Thomas' talk and to the book. I mean, Heather, you've also, in your work, written a lot about, not only that, you've written a book about Thomas' influence on economics and economic policy making. But in your own work, you've talked and written about how inequality influences economic growth, and that's been a particularly interesting connection in the context of the US and actually all the liberal democracies that have hardly experienced large levels of productivity growth over the last few decades. So fascinated to hear what you have to say about Thomas's book. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Thomas. I want to congratulate you on another big, bold book to, weigh down our bookshelves and, get us thinking. I finished reviewing the book just as the novel coronavirus hit our shores in the United States. And, we're talking today as issues of racial justice are at the forefront of our country's conversation. And so I think it's really interesting to be having this conversation about your book where you're trying to bring together questions of ideology and how the economy works in this moment of crises that I think are underscoring some of your key points. I think everything that we've seen so far in 2020 really underscores your key point that we do need ideological renewal. And I'm not going to spend much of my 10 minutes talking about this, but I do agree 100% that the toolkit starts with correctly measuring the economy. I really hope that you continue to focus your work around these questions of measurement. We have been, as you know, building on those here at Equitable Growth, but I think it is so important to be able to unpack what the economy is and to disaggregate all of that data to show what our economy is, and as you point out in the book, what our democracies are. I wanted, it was very interesting to see you focus so much on race in your comments for me this morning, for you this afternoon, and I want to echo some of those themes. One of the things that I found most exciting about the book was the renewed interest in Karl Polanyi. I would argue that he's probably the most important, least well-known economist of the 20th century, probably the one scholar that most economists haven't read that they should. And I want to actually, as you were talking, I sort of didn't have to drag out my Polanyi's right here, always by my desk. But, he makes a couple of points that I think are so important in contextualizing your book, which is that a market economy can only exist in a market society. And he also noted that a self-regulating market, the kind of economy that when you talked about the sacral nature of capital, I think is consistent with that idea of the self-regulating market, that this demands nothing less than the institutional separation of society into an economic and political sphere. And as I read your book, I saw you struggling to pull those two together. And that's a lot of what we have thought about at Equitable Growth. I mean, your term proprietarianism, which you define as a political ideology based on the absolute defense of private property, really grounds that the capital only exists within these broader social relations, but that, in the era that we are living in right now, what I like to think of as actually the old era, the 20th century version of economics, we believed that the laws of capital must be followed for the economy to deliver the most beneficial growth. And to that end, we reified capital ownership. We put our faith in the hope that market would deliver these optimal outcomes. And I think, at Equitable Growth, we have focused over the past 7 years to really unpack that, to understand whether or not the kind of inequality and the kinds of market outcomes that economics has long justified are actually justified on economic terms. And so I think that where I want to focus the rest of my remarks today is that bridging that gap between how we think of economic outcomes and how we think of social outcomes really is at the core of what I see you doing, but I think needs to be more at the forefront of the core of what economics needs to do. And so just to preview where I'm going to end my remarks here, in this book and in your other work, you call for a shift in how we think about economics, and I want to continue to push you to go further. I'll get to that at the very end, but I think we need to do even more with the profession. So, there's a lot of evidence now. You have pulled a lot of it together, but there are scholars all around the United States, all around the world, that are showing the ways that economic inequality systemically obstructs, subverts, distorts the pathways, the kinds of strong, stable, and broadly shared prosperity that supposedly our economies are supposed to deliver. And we can especially see that here in the United States, other countries right now, but I will just note that the US is particularly bad in terms of how we've dealt with the coronavirus and what the economic implications are. And as we watch this fast-moving train wreck here in the United States around the coronavirus, you can see that the failure to locate this health issue as core to what our economy is really the crux of the problem. We stopped believing that you actually needed people to be healthy in order to participate in the market economy. And because of that, we actually are literally destroying our market economy as we speak. We have new data on unemployment today that really shows, and will show, I'm sure, in the weeks to come, the damage that is, the real world damage that happens through this ideological construction that we've made, that you can somehow separate markets from the rest of society. But I want to focus on two conclusions that you make that are interconnected. So first, you make in the middle of the book, around the 800s, you have this whole section where you really focus on the fact that people are focusing their political energy on issues around identity and nationhood, because we've established this ideology that market outcomes are optimal and that redistribution is a distortion of the natural laws of the market. And to some extent, I agree with you, but I think that especially here in the United States, I take issue with the conclusion that we can actually move forward on a new understanding of markets, of the economy, without actually addressing some of those identity issues. Here in the United States, the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, the violence that continues ongoing into the modern era in terms of police brutality, that means that it is very difficult to figure out how we can have this conversation about the economy or inequality in this broad sense unless we're actually pushing through these challenges around racial justice. It's difficult to see how we can bring our country together to have the kinds of conversations that you are pushing without actually putting front and center questions of race. And I think that's more than just about identity. It's core to understanding how our economy works, as you pointed out in your slides, and how it's always worked. I'll just point out a couple of data points. There's recent work by a scholar who's on our research advisory board named Lisa Cook, who shows that lynching and other violence against Black Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s limited their applications for patents. And because of this violence, there were over 1,000 missing patents among African-American inventors over this time period. So on top of the trauma inflicted on generations of Black Americans, there was also this violence actually reduced the level, direction, and quality of U.S. productivity and growth. And there's no way to really think about how we're going to pull these people into our economy, into our society, unless we actually deal with the violence question. And so I think that there's a nuance there, and that I think we need to, which is why, to just start that paragraph over, I always keep coming back to Polanyi, that we need to understand how markets are embedded within our social institutions, and that separating them, that was the first error of economics, which I think underscores so much of what you're doing, but I think there is still this either or quality that I really do want to continue to push you on. I was really glad to see your data showing those slides around slavery and the wealth that created. As you know, in After Piketty, the book I co-edited, we included this wonderful, wonderful essay by Dana Ramey Berry on the importance of slavery in creating the wealth of the United States. And I think you can't understand American wealth, American capitalism, unless you understand these core points that got us here. And that leads me to where I want to conclude my remarks. So, throughout this book and in your other work, you call for a new political economy, and you call for greater engagement of economists in these questions. I noted that actually in this book, you didn't get to your really pointed criticism of economists until about 2/3 of the way through, and a lot of it focused on these questions around education. And I think all of that is really important. But I think we need to, I still think we need to push even further on greater collaboration and cross-fertilization across academic disciplines. And we need to figure out ways to foster a greater willingness within the economics profession to engage in questions around the very purpose of the economy. As I was reading the book, I was struck as I only had the review copy, so I didn't have the citations at the end or an electronic version. But as I was going through, I was struck by the word political science doesn't show up until somewhere in the 500s. That while you do cite a number of scholars outside of economics, there are, I think, a lot of places where other disciplines have thought deeply about some of the questions that you raise, and figuring out how to reconnect the dots to bring economics back into the fold of the social sciences, and to take that challenge that I think Polanyi puts forward really seriously will require not just big books, but also thinking about our engagement with the economics profession and how we think about the engagement of economists with policymakers. I actually tried to find it earlier this morning, and I couldn't because the book's like over 1,000 pages. But one book that I think is a really important new contribution on this particular question is Stephanie Mudge's book, also from Harvard University Press, also quite large. But what she does is she traces out the intersection, the interplay across a number of Western countries between economics, economists, and policy and politics. And that kind of interplay, the role that economists play in policymaking, the way that our profession's tendency to sort of say we can evaluate the economy as separate from the rest of the economy, the rest of our society, she traces out how we got there. And I think understanding that history and that interplay is critical to figure out how we move forward, both in making sure that economists are being forced in the policy debate to actually work with the people that they're supposedly representing. As you point out, left democratic parties have become much more elite institutions rather than grounded in different communities. But also, how it is that I really would hope in the conversation, how is it that we push the economics profession to take on this issue and to work more collaboratively with our colleagues in the other social sciences. So I believe my time is up, and I will stop there. But again, I just want to congratulate you and thank you for the opportunity to weigh in on in this conversation today.
Heather, thanks so much for those comments and some interesting points, Thomas, for you to pick up. And I think this idea of the history of the role of economics in policymaking and in structuring that ideological framework that we all operate within is absolutely key. So Thomas, do you want to respond to some of Heather's comments there? And I'll just point out before you do actually that also a lot of the questions that are coming in, that element of decolonizing economics in that broader sense as well, is actually really kind of picking up a lot on social media. So Thomas.
Yeah, let me say a few words about combination between racial justice and more sort of universal justice, and I think it's very important. Before I do that, okay, sorry if I don't refer explicitly to political science before page 700. I think I do. Look, I think I quote tons of political scientists, tons of historians, much more than economists. I think the people that could complain from this book are certainly more economists than historians or political scientists or sociologists. By the way, I agree, we have to do more to move the economics profession, but I should say, sometimes I'm a bit, I'm not so optimistic about, I think there are some segments of the economics professions that are going to be very hard to move. And so sometimes, I try to spend more energy trying to move the rest of the social sciences. So, I think young historians or sociologists or political scientists, should not abandon economic issues and the study of wage formation and wealth inequality. And, I think all these economic topics, were once very important research topics, in particular in social and economic history. And, I am very much, I'm trying to contribute to redevelop, the kind of annal schools that we had in France once, and more generally, having more historians and social scientists outside economics, taking up economic issues together with political, cultural, and ideological issues, because as I try to show in my book, you cannot study both separately. But coming back to your first point, and I think, very important point about the fact that, identity issues need to be addressed, and we cannot, and so I'm sorry if at some point in the book I sort of say, okay, we have to go beyond identity and just have a universal justice system, etc. What I try to say in the book, and what I tried to say during my presentation, is that we really need to do both. So I think in the case of reparation, and in the case of both in the US and in Europe, as I said, in Europe, people are trying to claim that it's a completely different story from the US past history with slavery and segregation. But I think, in fact, there's a lot in common in the way, North Africans or Sub-Saharan Africans were treated in the French colonial empires, and the way, slaves or descendants of slaves were treated in southern US, and many of the issues that we have to address today require us to confront this huge legacy of racism and discrimination. And in some cases, I think this requires explicit reparation. I mentioned the case of Haiti. I think in the case of the US, as you know, there was a law in 1988 giving $20,000 to each Japanese American that was interned during World War II and that was still alive in 1988. I think to me it will make sense to have something similar for people who had to suffer directly from racial segregation until 1965, and the fact that it was never addressed explicitly, or the fact that France never considered the possibility of repairing Haiti for financial transfers that were paid by Haiti to France until World War II, until 1950, just in order to compensate former French slave owners for their loss of property. If we don't confront this, it's going to be very difficult to build some notion of justice and commonly agreed justice principle. So I think we need to do both reparation and sort of universal policy for the future. So when I talk about equal inheritance, minimum inheritance for all in my book, ideally for the future, everybody, in my view, whether you're black or white or descendant of slaves or descendant of anybody, should get at age 25, I mentioned, 60% of average wealth, which is about median wealth, about 120,000 euros, which I think can make a big difference in life in terms of control over your own life, because it's more than just money. It's about power. It's about the possibility to say no to certain job offers and working conditions and wages. Because when you don't own anything, when you own zero, you have no negotiating power. You need to accept, whatever you are being proposed, because you need to pay for your bills. You need to, and so for people who own millions or billions, they don't really make the difference between owning zero or owning 100,000 or 200,000. But in fact, it makes a big difference. So in my view, we need to have both this kind of universal scheme and at the same time, reparation transfer, or reparation policy, and most importantly, anti-discrimination laws that are being applied, and people who are being sentenced when they don't respect these laws. So we have to find you have to do the both together, and not only in the US, in France and Britain, and as well. So I'm very much on your side on this, and sorry if it's some particular part of my book it's not said as clearly as it should. And please, if I miss important references, and I'm sure I miss lots of important references in my book, just send me email, send me the references. I will read them, and this will help me to improve myself for my next book. I have learned a lot from the book you edited, and even if I don't refer to it explicitly because this book has a strange title for me, as you can imagine. but I can tell you that I've learned a lot from reading these chapters, and I've tried in many ways to respond or to make progress following this. It's not enough, but I'm still young and I'm still going to try to make progress. So please send me all the important references which you think I should really include in my thinking for the next steps.
I can certainly imagine, Thomas, the almost existential feeling that came over when you received a copy of that book in the post.
Well, I knew in advance, but it's true that it's a strange title for me.
But in many ways, I mean, 2014 was, it made a difference that year in the way that the inequality was taken up in debate without a doubt. Law, of course, is another discipline which I think needs to be brought into the picture alongside economics, and not least the influence in the US, Heather, of sort of foreign economics courses and the way in which that has changed the legal profession. So I'm going to bring in now, and Heather, I'll come back to you shortly as well. I'm going to bring in Martin Sandbu, if I could. Martin, you've certainly addressed this question of identity in your recent work. Be great to hear your thoughts on Thomas' book and to take the discussion forward. So can I bring you in now, please, Martin?
Thanks very much. I hope I managed to unmute myself. Can you hear me, see me? Very good. What I thought I'd do is to talk a bit about how Thomas' work, this book in particular, but his sort of whole body of work has, I think, shifted the conversation in a big way, certainly shifted my thinking by highlighting three concepts, if you like, where his work has made a huge difference. And so the three concepts I want to talk a bit about are ideas, wealth, and internationalism. Ideas, of course, that's the big one, because the latest book about ideology, the main message is, of course, is that ideas matter. That's important. It might sound obvious, but it's been neglected to such a large extent in especially economics, much of social science, and it's fundamental, and it's fundamental for understanding the world. It's also fundamental if we want to change the world, which, as Marx told us, is the whole point. Now, one place where I probably differ from Thomas, but where there are fruitful discussions to be had in general, is how ideas interact with the other things that matter, the material conditions of the economy, technology, and so on. So just to give one example, Thomas is one of the people who've made us all much more aware of this U-shape in inequality from the end of the Second World War until today, where in every Western country, inequality fell until about 1980 and then started increasing after that along a lot of dimensions. One reason, of course, were ideas. There was an intellectual change around 1980. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum, and Thomas doesn't say this, but I want to emphasize how ideas interact with the economy on the ground. So one thing we know is that mass industrial employment kept increasing until about 1980. That's when the absolute number of factory jobs peaked in pretty much every Western country. It's gone downhill since then. As a share of total employment, it was declining already, but absolute numbers. And if we look at it, it turns out that the factory economy, the industrial economy, is kind of well suited for some ideas to take hold and be politically leading. So it's easier. The unions could organize more easily in a factory economy than they can in a digital gig economy. That's just one example. The factory economy, the late factory economy, also had some sort of inbuilt tendencies towards greater equality. That's what we saw in the decades after the war. For example, the optimal scale of a factory fits not quite nicely in a sort of mid-sized town. It could be spread across the territory, and we've seen regional equality. You saw regional convergence in the 3 decades after the war. You saw regional divergence in the decades since. So you already had structural forces for convergence and then divergence. And it's easier to advocate for redistribution, for example, when things are already kind of pointing in that direction for structural reasons. So these things go together. Of course, we've had there are ideational and intellectual reasons why we've had increases in inequality since 1980, but they've kind of piggybacked on structural changes that point in the same direction. Ideally, we would want new thinking in policy to offset damaging structural dynamics. If we don't do good work, then they'll reinforce one another. That's sort of what happened in the West, I think, since 1980, and it's work like Thomas, I think, that gives some opportunity to changing that. But just to mention a couple of examples of ideas that have been governing for policy in these last 4 decades. One idea is the efficiency equality trade-off, which comes out of economic modeling. You know, you can make a common sense argument for it. It's probably wrong. I think the experience of the Nordic countries in particular show that egalitarianism can actually be good for productivity growth and efficiency. But if you think about the third wave of social democratic politics in the 1990s, it was very much kind of premised on the idea that you have an efficiency inequality trade-off. You kind of need to let markets rule, and then you try and redistribute after the fact, but not too much. So that's one example of an idea that mattered, and probably mattered in a bad way. Another example of how an idea matters is that globalization, debates of globalization often tend to conflate or elide globalization and deregulation. And I think very often when people either complain about globalization or idolize it, it's really deregulation they are talking about, the ability to circumvent national rules. This is true on the anti-globalization front as well. So here is a debate that is really about how we understand the economy. And we're coming down with one particular answer, a hegemonic ideology, if you like, will actually constrain what politicians think is within their choice set, what they can reasonably try to do. So ideas are fantastically important, and I think it's increasing. It's particularly relevant today in the crisis we're in, where COVID has and the pandemic has turned everything upside down, including how we think about things. All the things that governments have done in the last couple of months were kind of unthinkable until very recently. And one thing I will ask Thomas about at the end of my remarks is, how does he think the ideas are shifting because of where we are now? We saw Emmanuel Macron say a month or two ago in this interview he did with the FT that, you know, once politicians have locked down economies in order to stop a respiratory virus, people will say, well, why can't you do something equally radical to stop climate change and stop pollution that also keeps us from breathing well? I don't know if he's going to be right, but that's the sort of question that's at stake now. The second big theme or big concept is wealth. And I mean wealth here as opposed to income. So in economics, in political debate, and generally, we know a lot about incomes. We talk a lot about incomes. We talk about income inequality. Thomas already in the previous book, in Capital, had a chapter documenting the change in wealth inequality. His other work has contributed to this. His collaborators have contributed to this. But I don't think we recognize often enough how important it is to complement our knowledge about incomes with knowledge about wealth, and just an understanding of how important the concept of wealth is. You could see in the talk he just gave how much of the focus here was actually on wealth inequality and who owns what, rather than just income. This is important for a number of reasons. As Thomas just said, wealth is what gives you power, and the distribution of wealth is probably what determines a lot of the distribution of power. And I would add probably the power to influence ideas. This is a conceptual contribution, just to say that who owns what is an important question. It's also a contribution to measurement and empirical knowledge. So if we think about, for example, the fact that we know that the wealth gap, I'm coming back here to Heather's discussion, the wealth gap between black and white Americans is much bigger than the income gap. that is really important information, and it's a sort of information that it would be harder to get if it hadn't been for the sort of work that Thomas and his collaborators have done. And of course, this leads to different ways of thinking about policy. It contributes to new ideas. And I'm very interested and encouraged by the increased focus on the wealth tax, taxing net wealth directly, that we've seen picking up in rich countries recently. Of course, Thomas himself makes a very concrete proposal for a wealth tax in the book, so I encourage everyone to look at that in detail. Some of his collaborators were behind Elizabeth Warren's proposal for a wealth tax in the Democratic primary campaign. Just today, there has been a project launched in the UK, a research project to establish how a net wealth tax in the UK could work. So ukwealth.tax, I think, for those who are interested. So there's interest here too. So there's something happening here. And I really would like Thomas to talk a bit more about that. And I think when we talk about wealth taxes, we're not always necessarily talking about taxing more. Thomas' own slides show that the size of the state as a share of the economy in rich countries is as big as it's ever been. It kind of increased up to about the 80s and has stagnated since then. So it's a question of whether taxing wealth is a matter of taxing more or taxing better. Maybe by taxing wealth, you can reduce other taxes that are less progressive, for example. The final idea, as I mentioned, is internationalism. And you've already heard this in the discussion we've had today. Simon, you pointed out, countries don't exist in isolation, so maybe they can't be governed in isolation. Thomas himself pointed out that you can't have single country explanations for a lot of these things that we see happen on the ground in the economy. This is a particular temptation in big countries, I think, to find sui generis explanations for dynamics and evolutions you see all across at least the rich world and maybe the entire world. The kind of global scope of Thomas' latest book is quite breathtaking. But the work like his, sort of encyclopedic work like this, highlight that there are often similar processes at work in one country after another. And that just means we need to look at deeper causes. Those could be, in terms of economic structure, global economic forces. They could also be the global role of ideas. So this is another aspect of both internationalism and the focus on ideas. Thomas writes in the book and talks generally about how ideas can diffuse internationally. An idea can be picked up in one place or be tried out in one place and then spread across the world. And you've seen this at various historical moments when you've had these shifts in what he calls inequality regimes. And of course, policy solutions can themselves be international, and some of his are internationally geared. He talks about an international wealth tax. He talks about how the rules of the EU need to be reformed to allow for a more progressive economy. So three hugely important and kind of big conceptual areas: ideas, wealth, and internationalism, that are really where Thomas' work make a big difference and a big contribution. So to finish, I just want to ask him really what he thinks now, in a way, tying together these three concepts. The situation we're in today, this unprecedented pandemic lockdown situation, how do you think that is changing the idea environment, ideologies, and how politicians in particular, but also voters, think about what is possible, feasible, desirable, in particular with a view to taxing wealth, perhaps rather than taxing other things, internationally or perhaps nationally, but in a way that could then be picked up elsewhere. So I'll end there.
Martin, thank you very much for those really well organised and articulated points. Thomas, there's a number of questions, but Martin honed you in there on the last one about how the current moment changes really the prospects for the sorts of wealth taxes that you and others have proposed, and for the political debate around that. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on that before I bring Heather also back in for a bit more of a discussion.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite impressive to see how the public discussion about wealth tax, has been changing over the past, 5 to 10 years, and I remember having a public debate with Elizabeth Warren in Boston in 2014 when my previous book came out, and at the time, she was very cautious and almost skeptical about the idea. I was proposing in the book of a wealth tax with a top tax rate between 5% or 10% per year for billionaires. And I remember, she said, well, and then, 4 years later, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were sort of competing about, who was going to propose the biggest wealth tax. And actually, initially, Elizabeth Warren started with a relatively low progressivities, and Bernie went very high, and she sort of followed on him. And there are other countries in the world where the public discussion has been changing also pretty fast. In Germany, I remember in 2014, I had a public discussion with Sigmar Gabriel, who was then the SPD vice chancellor, and he told me, never again, the SPD will advocate reintroducing a wealth tax, in a public debate at his ministry in Berlin in 2014. And I went back to Berlin just before the lockdown, in early March, and it was exactly the opposite situation. The SPD leadership, everybody was competing with one another in order to propose the biggest wealth tax, and the new SPD vice chancellor Olaf Scholz was explicitly advocating for the reintroduction of a wealth tax. And I had the similar experience recently with Dutch political parties, starting from the center left to the more to the left, where they are all pushing this kind of idea. So I think this is changing pretty fast, and I think there are good reasons for that, and because you've seen such a large increase of top wealth level at the top of the distribution in Europe, in US. It's very difficult to say that we are not going to ask any additional contribution to this group of people. Now, for the time being, I think the simplest thing to do is certainly to have more public debt and more money creation. And the other big shift in sort of popular opinion and popular thinking and public thinking about economic issues and financial issues is obviously the view that okay, we've been printing a lot of money to save the financial sector after 2008. So now, if you cannot do the same, to fight the pandemics and the consequences of the pandemics after 2020, people there will be a big misunderstanding, between public opinion and political and economic leaders if nothing is done in this direction. And I think it's important to have this in mind to understand the current discussion in Europe, where basically everybody now seems to be ready, or almost everybody seems to be ready, just to borrow, 500 billion or 1,000 billion euros in joint public debt, with the view, although this is not said explicitly, the common view is very much, okay, in any case, the European Central Bank, they will put this on their balance sheet, and basically we will never have to reimburse it. And I think we are still at this stage where we need to push further the monetary mechanism. I think ideally we would like to invest more and to have a little bit more inflation, 2%, 3%, 4%, and after, if we have 1 or 2 or 3 years with inflation 3-4%, then maybe we'll move to the wealth tax and we'll stop doing the money creation. But I think at this stage, there's so much the feeling that you can achieve a lot just through public debt and more money creation, and I think to some extent this is right, that we have not pushed this mechanism. Right now with interest rate close to zero, it's a very strong case for borrowing more and investing more. And so I think the real time for the wealth tax will come after this this particular stage. But we'll see. In any case, on these two critical issues, wealth tax and money creation, it's you know, it's a perfect illustration of what, you know, what I'm trying to say in general in my book, which is that dominant ideologies and dominant views about the economic system, you know, can change very fast in response to new challenges. And yeah, we have to follow this change very, very closely, you know, if we want to understand what's going to, you know, what's going to happen. And I think also, you know, about internationalism, you know, the thinking about how we organize globalization and about alternative federal organization for globalization, you know, are very important. And in my book, I try to quote some previous work, you know, looking at this reflection. Like, there's a very, very interesting book by Or Rosenbaum on globalism, and, you know, showing, you know, debates about how to organize post-World War II European Federation. You know, should we have a common progressive taxation? Should we just have a pure economic and financial union like Hayek was advocating at the time, which in a way is what happened, but this is only one of the possibilities that could have happened and that could happen in the future. So I think we really have to reopen the debate, you know, very broadly about different forms of internationalism and different ways to organize, you know, the regulation of markets at the transnational level. It will take a long time. I think this is just the beginning of the sort of reconstruction of a new form of internationalism and globalization, and you know, this is just a little step in this long run direction.
Thomas, thank you. I think it's good to come back to both the wealth tax and the idea of social federalism, which you mentioned towards the end there, and what Europe has become relative to that different vision of internationalism, as Martin mentions. But I'd like to bring Heather back in, and in a way to step us all back a little bit and pick up on something that both Heather and Martin have raised, Thomas, in relation to your work. And that's really this question of language, by which I mean numerical as well as linguistic. So, I mean, Heather, you've spoken about what we stand to gain by changing how we quantify and measure economic growth. So saying that it's also what we should be looking at is where it goes to, rather than simply how much it is. And there are other suggestions along those lines too. I mean, here in Norway, the economist Kalle Mune has written about adding to our category of national income, which is better than GDP, what he calls common income, that portion of national income that will be derived from things such as good institutions or just laws or effective governance, affect the economy be less productive without. Now, talking about common income is certainly a more radical suggestion than mainstream economic debate would have countenanced for many years, and yet in the spirit of Thomas' book, it's radical only really in the sense that it seems inconceivable from within the ideological constraints of the current inequality regime. Otherwise, a lot of it's just common sense. So Thomas, I mean, you've also encouraged a move away, and also in this book, even more so than the last, from Gini's to centiles, and you talk about the classe populaire and the sort of bottom 50%, which in many ways over the longer durée has been this kind of more residual element of society that's been overlooked, and that we can learn political lessons by looking at what's happened economically to that group. Martin, you've written as well in your book, I think, about how we need to reclassify and describe certain economic problems, that we don't just look at the quantity of jobs, for example, but the quality of jobs. And then Heather, this definitely picks up on a lot of your work. And of course, we add to who's in them, you know, from a gender perspective. And again, one could look to the Nordics here. Wage compression, which is much more common in these countries, is a feature of the economy that in the Nordics is really a form of incentive to innovation. It's a sort of tax on old plant in a sense. So my question really to all of you is, to what extent are all these changes just in our head? Clearly they're there in history, they're there in the past, we can look to them, we can learn from them. But if I can put it deliberately provocatively, do we need policy intervention, or do we just need politicians prepared to push for some form of what we know works from the past? So I'm happy for either or all of you to take that up.
I can let me start here, and then we can hand it off. I mean, I'm so glad you asked about this, because I think that this is something we've thought a lot about, and that we've had a lot of progress on recently in the United States. But I think it's so important. how it is that we talk about the economy, how it is that the media, the press explain what's happening, affects how everyday people all across the country actually, how they perceive it, right? They have their own experience. Do I have a good job? Do I have health insurance? Do I have all the things I need? But then they're also looking to people to tell them what's happening for the other 320 million people in our country. So today, as we still see that unemployment in the United States is higher than it's ever been since the Great Depression, we're also seeing the president talk about how, well, the stock market is up, so that means everything is good, right? And so we have this sort of sense of what it is that is measuring our economy and how that infiltrates all of our conversations. So I think this unpacking of a set of indicators, most of the indicators that we used were developed almost a century ago when economists were just figuring out how to measure the economy. When economists were working with pen and paper models, right? We didn't have access to the kinds of data on computers, let alone our phones, that we have access to now. That data just doesn't make sense anymore today, but it obscures more than it shows. So building on the work that Thomas has done with Emmanuel Saez and other scholars around the world on disaggregating growth, there's been some research that has shown that when we talk about national income here in the United States, which we know from this research disproportionately goes to those at the top, because the press focuses so heavily on GDP, a measure of national income so heavily, people don't understand that connection. And so it leads to this frustration because people are like, well, GDP doesn't represent me, but there's nothing actually there to replace it. So I think that is really important. But there's a second issue here that I think we can't lose, which is that for a lot of the 20th century, when economists have talked about economic progress, there's been the sense that the majority is doing fine, markets perform, but then there's this small group at the bottom that we just need to pull. Maybe we need to do a little redistribution for the very poor, but not the sense that the whole economy wasn't performing. And I think that's what unpacking this data really has been able to show, that it isn't, I would take issue, it's not just the bottom half. You look at the United States, it's really the bottom 80% that has not benefited from growth. That's a very different story than the market's doing just fine except for the very poor. It's a very different political story. It leads you to very, very different policy recommendations. And two more things, and then I'll hand the baton off. One thing that this COVID crisis has really underscored here in the United States is that we significantly undervalue in our economic data the role of care. Right, we're having this national conversation about getting back to work, and yet, when you read the newspapers and you listen to policymakers, opening bars and restaurants is getting a lot more airplay than whether or not we need to open daycares and schools. But yet, without daycare, schools, care for the aging that families are struggling with, you're not going to be able to have those people to staff those bars and restaurants, let alone go to them. But that is also not a part of our regularly released data. So how do we think about the need for care, that the work done in the home and the work that needs to be outsourced out of the home is another element that I think we need to bring into this conversation. But here is the problem. At least in the United States, changing this kind of data is incredibly difficult. We've created this wonderful set of statistical agencies of, nationally recognized experts who are doing an excellent job at the data that they have. And whenever you want to change it, they want to make sure that it is just as good, that the bar is just as high. And so one of the conversations that I've gotten into over the years about this is, well, we put out GDP 4 times a year, gross domestic product. It is revised upwards of 5 or 6 times because the first set of data is guesstimates, basically, and then we revise it. But when we start talking about adding new series or changing it, you'll notice the conversation moves very quickly to, well, but that data, it's got to be perfect. Right? And so we're sort of caught in this policy box where even though the data that we already have is imperfect, it doesn't tell people a story that resonates, it doesn't actually tell them what's going on in the economy or in their communities. Getting to changing it has become a gatekeeper exercise by brilliant and talented statisticians, but who want to make sure that we're holding our data to these really high standards. So getting through that sort of small p political problem, I think, is what stands in front of us and being able to articulate this.
Mm.
Yeah, Thomas, did you want to pick up on that as well? And I know
Yeah.
from the 2014 book, a lot of the talk was around, the extrapolation between data points and so forth, which of course you have to do to make that kind of argument. But it really touches on Heather's point there about how ingrained that then becomes in the discourse, right?
Yeah, no, changing the data and changing the statistical tools, is a political issue and is a political battle, and it's not something that should be left, to small groups of experts. And so I think it's very important that, the people who are very sometimes, politically involved in the fight against discrimination, or the fight against climate change, or for the environment, realize that we cannot just throw away existing statistics. We need to replace them by other statistics, because if we just throw away things without making concrete proposal, in fact, the people who are going to win are the conservative side, who will just keep with their old style statistics, because they will say, okay, you have nothing else to propose, so shut, don't intervene in this discussion. And so I think it's very important. I think there's a risk today. In particular, when we talk about the environment, I think we need to have some specific measures about carbon emission and biodiversity. So, we've tried to do work with Lucas Chancel at the World Inequality Lab, looking at the individual level distribution of carbon emission, and I quote some of this research in my book. But I think we also need to have some economic data on the inequality of income and wages, and we are not going to be able to construct norms of justice in order to fight climate change without talking about incomes and wages and wealth. It cannot be only about purely environmental indicators, because in order to measure who is paying what and who is going to, I think that, for instance, we will need to develop tools like a progressive individual carbon cart, where we actually measure individual carbon emissions, so that we can in effect make illegal emissions, individual emission above a certain level, or tax at very, very high level of carbon emission, and at the same time protect the people who have more reasonable level of carbon emission. So, some people don't like that. They say it's very, inquisitorial or whatever. But, we had the same argument at the time of the creation of the income tax a century ago. And, keep in mind that, private banks today, with our credit card information, they know already what we spend every day. And for some reason, we don't seem to, have any problem with that. And so I think, building collective trust in public administration in charge of the common good and fighting for the environment, is something that will take time. But in the end, we all have to come, together with new statistical and policy tools at the same time to solve this problem. And for this, we need to measure, of course, carbon emission, biodiversity, but we also need to measure income and wages, and comparing levels of carbon and wages, income and wages, which is sometimes something that, I can see, I have three daughters, 17, 20, 23, who are very strong, climate militant, and, I love them, and we need them. But I think we also need, sometimes they don't want to hear about, comparing the wage from one year to the other, or from one group to the other, because they feel that money indicators are all now, uninteresting today, and we should only talk about environmental indicators. But I think if we want to address environmental concern, we need to take seriously also the issue of economic justice and economic inequality and distribution of gains and losses, coming in particular from the new environmental policies that we need to conduct. And if we don't have a sort of broad citizen involvement in the development of this new data and new policy tools and statistical tools, we are not going to, the Center for Equitable Growth is doing a great job at developing, new law in Congress in order to increase transparency. We've tried at the World Inequality database, but that's not going to be enough. We are going to need much broader citizen involvement from all the people who are now very politically involved in all these issues, in order to change the way we measure the world in order to change the world.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, on the environment, Martin, unless you wanted to jump in there, but I might bring in a first question here as well, and it's from Francois Gérard, and put him on the side of your daughters, perhaps, Thomas, because he's asking here: would the environmental crisis be an interesting lever to regulate globalization more broadly, requiring pushing trade partners to follow similar environmental standards? It could be an opportunity, he says, to also require them to follow similar labor standards or social policies. It could bring different coalitions of voters, green voters, low economic opportunity voters, and so forth together to support a new globalization. And that's an interesting idea there around how you might rebuild globalization on a slightly different fundament. And I know, Martin, I know that is something you picked up in your earlier book, at least around the euro.
So does Martin want to respond, or do you want me to respond?
I'm happy for you to respond first.
Well, maybe I can say one thing that kind of leads it into what I said about Thomas' work, which is I think there's an example here of the importance of ideas that I mentioned in my initial remarks. So I talked about how one governing idea has been this elision between globalization and deregulation, right? So there's sometimes a sense that if you think you need to put controls on the sort of stuff that come into your jurisdiction, or limits on the conditions under which immigrants can come and work, that's somehow against economic openness and globalization. But I think that is precisely, we only think that because we're trapped in this idea that globalization and deregulation mean the same thing. But it seems to me that once we think clearly about this and we say, look, it's not that we're against imports from other countries. It's just that we want things to be produced according with our values, no matter where they're produced. We just want the same rules for everyone. So, it's open for imports, but if they submit to the same rules. So, one example here is a debate in the UK now about chlorine-washed chicken from the US, right? Another example is, are you against free movement of labor? Well, you could be for free movement of labor and yet insist that work standards and minimum wages should be upheld and enforced in the kind of receiving economy. There's an interesting distinction or comparison between the UK and Norway. Norway has had more immigration from Eastern Europe since 2004 compared to the population than the UK has. But it's in the UK that it's become a very difficult political issue. And Norway basically did more to put in place national policies that stopped downward pressure at the bottom of the wage distribution. But we need to separate deregulation and globalization to be able to even kind of propose these policies in a sensible way. So this is where I think the ideology work that Thomas contributes to is so important. It makes us a bit more lucid about these things.
Yeah, I think this is really the difficult challenge that we have ahead, is to redefine, what's a legitimate restriction on free trade and free capital flows. Because I think we still live in an era where many people are going to be afraid, are going to say, okay, but if you start questioning this kind of trade or this kind of capital flow, where are you going to end, etc. So I think it's very important to set out clear principles. So carbon adjustment at the frontier for exports and imports is one way to do it. To have very clear rules about how you're going to compensate for the carbon content of import and exports. But I think it's broader than this. It's also, look, if assume you believe you need to have a certain tax rate on corporate profits, 30% or 40%, whatever, and you trade with a country that has 0% profit tax. What should you do? Well, I think you should say, okay, the companies that are producing in your country, they have a tax deficit as compared to my company. So now, if they want to export goods and services to my country, they're going to have to pay some adjustment tax. Now, the difference with the standard tariff or protectionist policies is that if the other country, if they move their corporate tax rate up to 30% or 40%, then this compensation tax will disappear. So it's a very different kind of protectionism, because in a way it tries to put incentives on other countries to move in this direction. So ideally, ideally, if we were to move in this direction, I think this could move everybody, in the direction of a more equitable and more sustainable organization of the global economy. Now, in practice, of course, the big difficulty is going to be that in some, in many real-world cases, it's going to be difficult to make the difference between someone who has really clear argument and clear justification for putting this kind of transitory tariff or incentive-based, equity-based or carbon-based tariff, and someone like Trump who just wants to increase tariffs on China or French wine or whatever, just for nationalist reason. Because everybody will claim to have a good reason to do that, and the question is, how do we construct a language and a way to measure these things so that, in the end, some sort of common, agenda, progressive internationalist agenda can win the day. And that's not going to be easy. And, this is the reason why people are still so attached to the view that we should stick to free trade, free capital flows, because otherwise, if we move away from that, it's going to be complete chaos. I think it's possible to respond to this concern. But if we want to be able to respond to this concern, we have to take it seriously. So, the ideal, it's like, this sort of sacralization of free trade, which is a little bit the equivalent of the sacralization of private property that we had in the 19th century, is a powerful ideology. I mean, in the end, it's not fully convincing. It can be, and it needs to be replaced by something more ambitious. But if we want to be able to do that, we have to take it seriously.
Martin, did you want to come back on that? And I think I saw maybe Heather
just very quickly, because I think that the tax issue, the international corporate tax issue, is such a good example. There is now a process underway at the OECD to try to fix the international corporate tax system. And one of the proposals is in the direction, to my saying, not ambitious enough, but a sort of minimum international tax, so that if you're not taxed elsewhere, at least you can be taxed here, right? Why did that get underway? I think it got underway because a couple of countries started acting unilaterally, and France has gone the furthest, actually imposing a turnover tax that kind of mimics a profit tax, as if the big digital giants were actually incorporated in France. But why did that happen? Why did they act unilaterally in the last few years? They could have done that 20 years ago. And that is because ideas changed. It's because partly it becomes kind of too egregious, and everyone sees these companies have to pay more tax. And the politicians who previously thought we can't do that, or they didn't even think about it, now think about it. And this is just a fantastic example, I think, of how ideas really drive real change on the ground.
No, okay. Now, yes, it is a very interesting example, except that for now, it has not really been applied. And one of the reasons why it has not really been applied is because so far, the French government proposal is actually focused upon one sector, which is the high-tech GAFA sector, which makes it very easy for the US administration to respond, okay, you just want to tax, big tech companies because these are US companies. So now we are going to tax the French wine. And so this is, I think, a good example of why, we have to be very careful at how this is framed and how this is thought through. And if this is not a universal mechanism, or universal in the sense, not in the sense that everybody has to adopt it, because that's not going to happen, but in the sense that it applies to all economic sectors in a way that's sort of equitable, and that in principle the point can be made that everybody could do the same, and this will bring us in a better collective equilibrium than we were before. Then you can end up in some stupid trade wars between Macron and Trump and China and etc. And so, yeah, it's a very good example of in order to see what details are going to make it work or not work. And at this stage, it has been talk. There's been a lot of talk about that, but we don't yet know how it's going to work.
Well, ideas change, as you say, Martin, but also the stakes change as well. And I think as well on that topic of unilateral countries moving forward with an agenda, which often really is how the change happens at the international level. And you look at Merkel and Macron now with the rescue package that's being debated at the EU about what it is that pushed them towards finally, taking that step. I mean, it's not quite the Hamiltonian moment that some people have described it. It's a bit of a are wade into the waters of the Rubicon way towards fiscal union, which we haven't had really before, ever since Maastricht. That's not been a live discussion at all. And I think that's, you know, an incredibly interesting example of how these sorts of things do come about in certain contexts. Heather, if you want to just add a quick comment, and then I'm going to go to a series of questions actually as our final set of questions to all of you, picking up again on this issue of race.
Yeah, quick comment. Two things connected. I mean, I think it is this conversation where in Thomas's book, the layering of what democracy means becomes so challenging and important. How we think about the global order, but also how we think about people and communities having a say over what their economy looks like and what's happening. And the second point, which is related to this, is that as I look at the US case and what I see happening over the next year, given the economic crisis that we are having because of the coronavirus, because of the failed response, it is highly likely that we're going to have to take steps to think about the production side of the economy, to think about what some folks would call the pre-distribution side. That's going to have implications for this conversation we're having right now, ongoing implications for both trade, for globalization. How is it that we think about what we need to produce in our country to create jobs, around climate change and the like? And so this question of how fast ideologies can change and to what end is going to emerge, I think, in a more potent way over the next year. And to what end are countries having to focus on what they perceive as the best interest for their citizens versus the global order that we've had for the last century. So I just want to elevate that, but I think that in many ways climate is at the core of this, and this question of how much you can do versus pre-distribution versus redistribution. That's a lot, but I want to get on to the listener, the questions.
No, they're really good points actually, Heather, and they pick up on a number of other questions that we've had in around production as well, which I think really is something that points us as well, again, back to that international and global interlocking of different national systems and how the economy out there in the world really is wedded into the sorts of policy freedoms that you have to make and to change things domestically. But on that matter of exactly what are the critical things, and it's always an act of prioritization, that's what politics is. I really want to come back to this question of race, and also even to put it more sharply, of reparations, and to bring that out of some of the questions here. One question to you, Thomas, which I'll ask you just to respond to, then perhaps Heather and Martin can jump in if they want to. It says here, I read your blog post on reparations, on the current political reality in the US, and there have been a whole series of other countries as well, also looking at the UK and France and bringing that into the picture. It's unlikely, they say, that we'll see reparations for American descendants of slavery. Public opinion polls, such as Reuters and Ipsos, also show that only 20% of Americans support it, but an overwhelming majority opposes. How do you think the country can address the racial wealth gap without race-specific policy or reparations? Thomas, you may need to unmute.
You're right. Yes, sorry about this. So first, I think the kind of universal redistributive policies that I'm advocating, in effect, will benefit a lot, the minorities. So, when if you have this, minimum inheritance for all of $120,000 or $150,000, in effect, it will lift up the bottom, and in particular it will lift up all the minority groups in the bottom. So it's possible to have universal redistributive policies that will in effect reduce racial gap and brings more economic justice on racial issues. Now, that being said, I think we should not abandon, the perspective of reparation, and even if today, there's no majority in favor of this, there are many issues in history where, there was no majority to abolish the death penalty in France in 1981, and still it was abolished, and now nobody wants to reintroduce it. And in the case of the reparation to Japanese Americans, there was no majority to approve this reparation during the 50s, during the 60s, during the 70s, even during the 80s. Remember, Ronald Reagan, tried to put his veto on this reparation to Japanese Americans. This was the time when he was, he refused to have embargo on apartheid South Africa. This was the time, and things things change. So I think it's, you know, of course, it's easier to have reparation for people who are still alive. And, you know, this is what was decided for the Japanese American. You know, it applied initially, you know, to the people in 1988 that were still alive and who had been interned during World War II. So it's easier to do it for people who suffered explicitly from the segregation than for the children, the grandchildren, etc., because it brings you in lots of complication about, you know, the exact family history and mixed marriage. And, you know, some people could have become very wealthy, you know, so what do you do? And so this is why, you know, universal justice policy, you know, is to me for the future, you know, as absolutely critical part. But at the same time, we need to address, you know, reparation as well, not only for symbolic reason, but I think because, you know, again, you know, it's very difficult. Where even today, you know, we're still carrying out reparation for spoliation of properties that happened during World War I and World War II. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a case in Germany where the Hohenzollern family, you know, the family of Wilhelm II, you know, the Prussian emperor during World War I, they were asking for reparation for artwork that they claim was in one of their castles, which then became the property of the state. And you know, some of these people are getting reparation until today, and sometimes it's, you know, you have also spoliation, of course, of Jews during World War II, and you still have reparation today. And so if you say, okay, you know, Haiti does not deserve any discussion about any possible reparation, and people who suffered from racial segregation do not deserve any discussion, you know, you put yourself in a position, in a very difficult position, basically, because then it's you know, it's very difficult to make people you know, agree on some sort of universal principle for the next steps. So yeah, I think we have to take seriously this discussion on reparation.
Yeah, I mean, it's really one of the crunch points, or the switch points, as you use them, and I really like that phrase in your book that we've reached about how we make different choices going forward, and I think we can probably all agree we're at one of those points. Heather and Martin, I would love to bring you in on that, but I've just been receiving notes that say that we'll be cut off automatically. This is the new big data guillotine that brings us to the end of our discussions. If we like, as in the old days, to keep rambling on, we could keep talking. It's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot from speaking to all of you and from hearing your thoughts. Thomas, thank you to you for the book and the provocation to hold this event today. And thank you to Heather Boushey and to Martin Sandbu for your fascinating commentary and questions. There's so much more to discuss, and I hope that everybody will have a chance to go away and ruminate in relation to all three of your books. And Heather's book, Unbound, is also, of course, a wonderful and worthwhile read. With that, I will wish you all well. Thank you for your time. Keep well, think well, and that's it from us. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Simon, Esther, and
Thank
Martin.
you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.